One concert, one phone call, one accident, and then silence. Some of the biggest bands of the 70s didn't fade out slowly. They were just gone. No farewell tour, no warning, no second chance. Here are 12 bands from the 1970s that disappeared overnight and the disturbing reasons why. Number 12, Lynyrd Skynyrd. On October 17, 1977, Lynyrd Skynyrd released their fifth studio album, Street Survivors. The cover showed the band standing in a street surrounded by flames. 3 days later, their chartered Convair CV-240 ran out of fuel mid-flight between Greenville, South Carolina, and Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Both engines went out. The pilots attempted an emergency landing in a wooded area near Gillsburg, Mississippi. They didn't make it. Lead vocalist and founding member Ronnie Van Zant was killed, along with guitarist Steve Gaines. His sister, Cassie Gaines, who sang backing vocals, assistant road manager Dean Kilpatrick, and both pilots. 20 others survived the crash, though none without injury. Gary Rossington broke both arms, both legs, and his pelvis. Steve Gaines had joined the band just 1 year earlier. Aerosmith had considered chartering that same plane for their own tour that summer, but concerns about the flight crew led them to look elsewhere. The National Transportation Safety Board determined the probable cause was fuel mismanagement by the crew. MCA Records immediately pulled the original album cover. The Flames image was too much to look at. The surviving members disbanded out of grief and physical necessity. It would be 10 years before Ronnie's younger brother, Johnny Van Zant, stepped in to reform the band in 1987. Lynyrd Skynyrd was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2006. Number 11, Led Zeppelin. By September 1980, Led Zeppelin was preparing for a major return to North America, their first American tour since 1977. The 1977 tour had already ended badly, cut short when Robert Plant received word that his 5-year-old son, Kerak, had died of a stomach infection back in England. The band had not toured America since that night. Now, 3 years later, rehearsals had begun at Bray Studios in Windsor, and the plan was finally moving forward. On September 24th, drummer John Bonham was picked up by a band assistant and arrived at rehearsals having already been drinking heavily throughout the day. That evening, the band retired to guitarist Jimmy Page's home, Old Mill House, also in Windsor. Bonham fell asleep and was put to bed. Sometime during the night, Bonham, who was 32 years old, asphyxiated on his own vomit. When tour manager Benji Lefebvre and John Paul Jones went to check on him the following afternoon on September 25th, they found him unresponsive. An ambulance was called, but there was nothing to be done. The coroner's inquest concluded that he had consumed the equivalent of roughly 40 measures of vodka in the preceding hours. The death was ruled accidental, and no other substances were found to be involved. The North American tour was canceled immediately. Peter Grant, their manager, began making calls. On December 4th, 1980, the 3 surviving members, Robert Plant, Jimmy Page, and John Paul Jones, released a formal statement saying that the loss of their dear friend, together with the sense of undivided harmony felt by themselves and their manager, had led them to decide they could not continue as they were. There was no replacement drummer considered, no auditions, no discussion of carrying on under a different name. Led Zeppelin was over just like that. They had made 9 studio albums in 11 years, sold hundreds of millions of records, and never played together again as a band. The only partial exception came in 1985 at Live Aid, where Plant and Page performed with Phil Collins and Tony Thompson on drums, a set widely described as underprepared and difficult to watch. The real reunion, with Jason Bonham, John's son, on drums, came just once at the Ahmet Ertegun tribute concert at the O2 Arena in London in December 2007. One night, one show, and then nothing again. Number 10, Badfinger.
I remember finding out about you.
Badfinger started with everything going for them. The Welsh band, originally called the Ivies, became the first act signed to the Beatles' Apple Records in 1968. Paul McCartney wrote their debut hit for them. George Harrison produced one of their albums. They played at Harrison's concert for Bangladesh. Tom Evans and Pete Ham co-wrote Without You, which became a worldwide #1 for Harry Nilsson in 1971. By the early 70s, they were being called the next Beatles. Their manager, Stan Polly, was moving money in ways that never reached the band. A financial audit commissioned by Warner Brothers in 1974 revealed that an escrow account meant to hold around $600,000 in advances for Badfinger had been emptied. Warner Brothers pulled their album Wish You Were Here from shelves while it was selling 25,000 copies a week. The record effectively ceased to exist overnight. With the income gone and the legal walls closing in, Pete Ham found himself unable to pay his mortgage, unable to reach Polly by telephone, and unable to see a way forward. His girlfriend was 8 months pregnant. On April 24, 1975, 3 days before his 28th birthday, Ham hanged himself in his garage studio, his suicide note named Polly directly. Tom Evans, who had found Ham's body that morning, never fully recovered. He told people he wanted to be where Pete was. On November 19, 1983, Evans hanged himself in his garden. He was 36. At the time of his death, there were over $1 million in frozen royalties waiting to be released. Money that arrived too late for both of them.
My mind is all around you.
Number 9, The Band.
May your heart always be joyful.
Robbie Robertson had made up his mind. 16 years of near-constant touring had ground him down, and he had watched what that life was doing to the people around him. Richard Manuel and Rick Danko had both developed serious dependency problems on the road. Levon Helm was carrying resentment over songwriting credits he believed he'd been denied. He felt that Robertson had claimed writing credit on songs that had been shaped collectively and that anger had been festering for years. The band, as Robertson saw it, was dissolving from the inside regardless. He organized something extraordinary as a farewell. On Thanksgiving Day, November the 25th, 1976, the band played their final concert at the Winterland Ballroom in San Francisco. Tickets had sold out almost immediately. The guest list read like a who's who of rock and roll. Bob Dylan, Eric Clapton, Neil Young, Joni Mitchell, Van Morrison, Muddy Waters, Dr. John, Emmylou Harris, and others all took the stage over the course of the evening. Martin Scorsese was there with multiple cameras and a full crew. It became the concert documentary The Last Waltz, released in 1978, still considered one of the finest concert films ever made. What people didn't know that night was how completely it was over. Robertson had planned the concert as the end of touring, not necessarily the permanent end of the band. But when he tried to book studio time in the days afterward, and his bandmates didn't show up or couldn't be reached, he understood what that meant. Levon Helm never forgave Robertson for what he saw as a unilateral decision to end the band, and he wrote about it in his 1993 memoir with considerable bitterness. Richard Manuel took his own life in March 1986 after a concert in Winter Park, Florida. He had checked into a Holiday Inn and was found the following morning. He was 42. Rick Danko died in 1999 from heart failure. Levon Helm died in 2012 after a long battle with throat cancer. Robbie Robertson died in August 2023. The Last Waltz really was the last waltz. Number 8, Derek and the Dominos. Eric Clapton formed Derek and the Dominos in 1970 with Bobby Whitlock on keyboards, Carl Rattle on bass, and Jim Gordon on drums. The whole point was anonymity. Clapton wanted to be just one of the band. No spotlights, no godlike expectations. Their only studio album, Layla and Other Assorted Love Songs, was recorded in Miami with Duane Allman sitting in on guitar. It didn't chart in the UK at all and only reached number 16 in the United States. The band reconvened in London in early 1971 to record a second album, and the sessions broke down completely within days. The recordings that did exist from those sessions were never released. By that point, heroin had taken hold across the group. Clapton later described the sessions as characterized by total paranoia. No one trusted anyone, the atmosphere was poisonous, and the music stopped coming. He withdrew entirely from public life, spending the next 3 years at his home in Surrey, Hurtwood Edge, largely unreachable. Friends and fellow musicians tried to intervene. Pete Townshend of The Who organized a comeback concert for Clapton at the Rainbow Theatre in London in January 1973, pulling together a lineup that included Steve Winwood and Ron Wood to coax him back on stage. Clapton performed, but he wasn't ready. Real recovery didn't begin until 1974, when he sought treatment at Harley Street. The story around the band kept getting darker. Duane Allman, who had played on the original album, died in a motorcycle accident in October 1971, just a year after the sessions. Carl Rattle died in 1980 from the effects of alcohol and drug use. Drummer Jim Gordon, who had undiagnosed schizophrenia, murdered his mother in 1983 and spent decades in a state psychiatric facility. He died there in 2023. By then, Clapton was the only surviving member. Layla eventually became one of the most celebrated rock albums ever made. But the band that made it never had a chance to know that. Number 7, The Eagles. By the summer of 1980, the Eagles were exhausted in every direction. The recording of The Long Run had taken 18 months and left the band wrung out. The tour that followed wore what was left of them down to nothing. On July 31st, 1980, they played a fundraising benefit for California Senator Alan Cranston at Long Beach Arena, and it was the last concert they would perform for 14 years. Before the show, Senator Cranston was thanking each band member backstage. When he got to guitarist Don Felder, Felder made a dismissive remark under his breath after the senator's wife walked away. Glenn Frey overheard it and exploded. The two of them took the stage with that fury still burning. During the set, Frey leaned over to Felder and told him exactly what he was going to do to him when it ended. Felder counted down songs in response. After the last note, Felder smashed a guitar backstage. Frey left in a fury. Felder left in a limo. Bassist Timothy B. Schmidt called Frey the next day to ask about the schedule. Frey told him there was no schedule. There was no band. The Eagles' formal dissolution wasn't acknowledged until 1982. They reunited in 1994 for the Hell Freezes Over tour, but the old fractures remained. Felder was fired from the band in 2001. Glenn Frey died in January 2016 at 67. The two men never reconciled. Number 6, Big Star. Big Star formed in Memphis in 1971. Co-led by singer-songwriter Chris Bell and former teen pop star Alex Chilton, the band made a debut album, #1 record, in 1972 that was praised heavily by the music press and essentially ignored by the public. The problem was distribution. Their label, Ardent Records, had a deal with Stax. and Stax was focused almost entirely on soul music. Copies of #1 records simply never appeared in many stores. Chris Bell, who had put enormous personal investment into the band's creation, grew deeply disenchanted by the commercial failure and the fractured relationship with Chilton. He left Big Star in 1972. The band continued as a trio and recorded Radio City in 1974, another album that sold poorly despite strong critical notices. Bassist Andy Hummel departed after that, and what remained of the band recorded a third album so dark and erratic that their label refused to release it. That album, later known as Third/Sister Lovers, finally saw release in 1978 after the band had already collapsed. Chris Bell died in a car accident in December 1978 at 27. He had been working on solo recordings. The cruelest part of Big Star's story is that their influence spread quietly and enormously. R.E.M., The Replacements, and Teenage Fan Club all pointed directly to Big Star as essential. Their song In the Street became the theme for the TV series That 70s Show. Almost no one who bought that show's soundtrack had ever heard of Big Star. Number 5, T-Rex. Mark Bolan built T-Rex into one of the defining sounds of early 70s Britain. The band had a string of glam rock hits from 1970 onward: Ride, A White Swan, Hot Love, Get It On, Telegram Sam, Metal Guru. At their peak in 1972, they were selling out Wembley Arena and headlining across Europe. Bolan was one of the most immediately recognizable figures in rock. The corkscrew curls, the glitter, the platform boots. By the mid-70s, T-Rex's commercial standing had declined sharply. Punk had arrived and changed what mattered. Bolan was working to adapt. By 1977, he had a regular television program in the UK called Mark, produced by Granada Television, where he featured young punk and new wave acts alongside himself. The Jam appeared on the show. Generation X performed. The Damned had supported Bolan on his spring 1977 UK tour. The show was a genuine attempt by Bolan to stay connected to what was happening in music, and the final episode, recorded on September 7, 1977, featured David Bowie, the two old friends duetting and jamming together on camera, with Bolan famously tripping over a microphone cable and falling off the stage near the end. On September 16, 1977, 9 days after that final episode was recorded, Bolan was a passenger in a Mini driven by his girlfriend, singer Gloria Jones. In the early hours of the morning, returning home from a dinner in Berkeley Square, the car left the road on Barnes Common in southwest London and struck a steel-reinforced fence post and a sycamore tree. Bolan was killed instantly. He was 29 years old and had never learned to drive. The last episode of Mark aired posthumously on September 20th, 1977. T-Rex, without its founder, ceased to exist. Number 4, Thin Lizzy. Thin Lizzy reached the peak of their commercial success in the late 1970s with their twin guitar lineup of Brian Robertson and Scott Gorham alongside bassist and vocalist Phil Lynott. Their 1976 live album, Live and Dangerous, became one of the best-selling live albums of the decade. They were a formidable live act, and Lynott was one of the most charismatic frontmen in rock, a black Irishman from Dublin who had grown up being told there was no place for someone like him in the music industry, and who had built one of the most beloved hard rock bands in Europe anyway. The band formed in Dublin in 1969 and spent years grinding through the club circuit before breaking through in 1973. By the late 70s, they were selling out arenas across the UK and Ireland, and Lynott had become a genuine icon. What was happening off stage was a different story. Lynyrd had been struggling with drug and alcohol dependency for years. He left the band for a solo career in 1983, and Thin Lizzy officially disbanded that same year, with their final concert taking place in Nuremberg, Germany, on September 4th, 1983. Lynyrd continued working, but the addiction was winning. On Christmas Day, 1985, he collapsed at his home in Kew, London, and was taken to the hospital. He had septicemia and pneumonia, both connected to his substance use. Phil Lynott died on January 4th, 1986, at 36 years old. His mother, Philomena Lynott, later became one of Ireland's most prominent advocates around addiction awareness, speaking about her son's death plainly and without softening the circumstances. A statue of Lynott stands on Harry Street in Dublin's city centre. The other members of Thin Lizzy have periodically reconvened over the years, but Lynott's absence made those efforts something different from the original band. Number 3, Fleetwood Mac, the Peter Green era. The Fleetwood Mac that most people know, the Rumours lineup of Stevie Nicks, Lindsey Buckingham, and the others, came together in 1975. But the band had a completely different existence before that, one that ended far more abruptly. The original Fleetwood Mac formed in London in 1967, led by guitarist Peter Green. Green was one of the most gifted blues guitarists of his generation. B.B. King once said there was only one musician who gave him the cold sweats, and that was Peter Green. In 1970, Green left the band after performing at a commune near Munich in Germany, run by a group of people who were part of a broader counterculture scene. What happened at the commune has never been fully documented, but what followed Green's time there was unmistakable. He began giving away his money, large sums of it. He told the other band members that musicians shouldn't earn royalties and that wealth was corrupting. He showed up at the offices of his accountants demanding that his earnings be sent to charitable causes. He started showing up to places unannounced and behaving erratically. He had been experiencing what his family later described as the beginning of schizophrenia, a condition that would not be properly diagnosed for years. And it has also been widely reported that LSD played a role in accelerating or triggering what happened during his time at the commune. Green's departure in May 1970 left the band without its founder and primary creative force. He was eventually committed to psychiatric institutions in the early 1970s and received electroconvulsive therapy. He spent years largely out of public life. The band he left behind survived and eventually transformed into one of the best-selling acts of all time. But the original Fleetwood Mac, the one Peter Green built, vanished the moment he walked away. Number 2, Roxy Music. Roxy Music announced their split in August 1976, at the height of their commercial profile. Brian Ferry, the band's singer and primary creative force, had been pulling toward a solo career for some time. He had already released 3 solo albums between 1973 and 1976, while still in the band, which created its own tensions about where his priorities lay. The friction between his direction and that of the other members had been building for years, compounded by the earlier departure of Brian Eno in 1973 after creative disagreements with Ferry. Eno and Ferry had clashing visions for what the band should be doing, and once Eno left, the band's more experimental edge softened considerably. Their final album before the split, Siren, had been released in 1975 and contained some of their most polished and commercially accessible work. It reached number 4 on the UK albums chart, but polished and accessible wasn't where some of the other members wanted to stay. Brian Ferry went on to record a series of solo albums throughout the late 70s, leaning heavily into his long obsession with old Hollywood glamour, jazz standards and torch songs. The other members scattered in different directions. Phil Manzanera released solo records and worked as a producer. Andy McKay composed for film and television, and Brian Eno, already well into his solo career by this point, went on to produce some of the most important albums of the era, including David Bowie's Berlin Trilogy, Talking Heads' Remain in Light, and U2's The Unforgettable Fire, reshaping the sound of late 70s and early 80s rock in ways few people anticipated. Roxy Music reunited in 1979 and went on to have arguably their biggest commercial success with Avalon in 1982, an album that reached #1 in the UK and stayed on the charts for over a year. But the 1976 dissolution was real. It ended one chapter of the band's story permanently. The version of Roxy Music that had existed as a genuinely experimental and confrontational act, one that nobody quite knew how to categorize when they first appeared, was gone by the time they came back. The reunion made beautiful records, but it was something different. Number 1, Free. Free formed in London in 1968 when the 4 members were teenagers. The youngest, bassist Andy Fraser, was just 15 at the time. They were managed by Alexis Corner, one of the founding figures of British blues, who introduced them to each other and helped shape their early sound. Paul Kossoff, the son of British actor David Kossoff, was 17 when the band came together and already playing guitar at a level that stopped people cold. Free broke up for the first time in 1971, reformed, and then broke up for good in 1973, because there was simply nothing left to hold them together. Vocalist Paul Rodgers and Kossoff had been the creative core, but by the time of the final breakup, Kossoff's health was deteriorating rapidly and visibly. He had developed a serious dependency on drugs and alcohol that was affecting his ability to perform consistently. There were shows he couldn't finish. There were tours where he had to be sent home. The band had tried everything they could think of to keep him functional, including bringing in a second guitarist to cover for him when he couldn't play, but the situation had gone past the point of management. The band's farewell tour ran through early 1973, and it was clear to everyone on the road that the end was real this time. Andy Fraser had already left before the final split, and the band's lineup in its final months was a shadow of what it had been. Rodgers went on to form Bad Company alongside drummer Simon Kirke, bassist Boz Burrell, and guitarist Mick Ralphs from Mott the Hoople. That band signed to Led Zeppelin's Swan Song Records and had almost immediate commercial success, their debut single going to #5 in the UK and #1 in the US. Paul Kossoff formed his own group, Backstreet Crawler, and was working on new material, but his health continued its decline, despite periods where it seemed like he might stabilize. On March 19, 1976, Paul Kossoff died aboard a flight from Los Angeles to New York. He had suffered a heart attack mid-flight. He was 25 years old. His father, David Kossoff, grief-stricken, later became a public speaker on drug awareness, touring schools and churches to talk about what addiction had done to his son. Free had produced All Right Now in 1970, one of the defining rock singles of that era, and Wishing Well and The Hunter in the years that followed. But they were gone before most of their audience fully understood what they'd had. Behind the records and the tour dates and the gold albums, there were people navigating things that had nothing to do with the music. A plane running out of fuel, a phone that never got answered, a car hitting a fence post in the dark. These were real endings, not industry announcements. They happened on specific days, to specific people, and they left behind music that outlasted the circumstances that cut it short. If a story in here stayed with you, drop it in the comments. And if you want more of this, hit like and subscribe. There's no shortage of stories worth telling.